Hello everyone. This lecture talks about the market forces of supply and demand. What we are going to do in this chapter is that we would be understanding what is demand, what is quantity demanded, what are the factors that affect demand, what are the factors that affect supply. We would then go ahead and do an equilibrium situation where we would be taking demand and supply together. We would be finding equilibrium, and at last what we would be doing is we would be simultaneously changing the factors that affect demand and affect supply, and then we would check what happens in that case when these factors affect my demand or supply curve. So let's begin with this chapter. So in this chapter, we are going to answer these questions. First, which are the factors which affect buyers' demand? Second, what factors affect suppliers' supply of goods? Third, how do supply and demand determine the price of goods and quantity sold? So, ideally what I'm saying here is, how does supply and demand come together into the market? How do the two forces come together, and how is the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity determined in the market? How do changes and factors that affect demand or supply affect market price? Which means, if some factor affects my demand, for example, because COVID-19 is there, we are saying that the demand of sanitizers has increased. So there is one factor in place. There is a change in taste and preferences of people. There is a situation in the economy which has led to increase in the demand of certain factors. So the question that then arises is, when my demand or when my supply of certain thing is affected due to certain factors, what happens in the economy in that case? What happens to the market price? What happens to the equilibrium quantity? And at last, we want to understand, how do market allocate resources? Now, this last part that we're talking about here is actually a macroeconomic situation kind of thing. So, I understand that this is the amount of demand, this is the amount of supply. There are two things that I have to understand. Is demand of a resource exactly equal to supply of resource? Yes or no? If not, is it a shortage or is it a surplus? So in all such scenarios, how is market working? What is the scenario of the market that is taking place is what we want to understand. Let us now try and understand what is market and what is competitive market. So these are some basic definitions that you should understand, and not only that you should understand, but also they're important in the long run, because a lot of times people get confused between a perfectly competitive and a competitive market. All right, so let's understand what is a market first. Whenever buyers and suppliers meet at a place for any transaction of a product that they do, it becomes a market. So to give you an example here, if I say that you and your friend meet at a place and you give a book to your friend, you sell the book to your friend, and in return of that book you end up getting some money from your friend, and it's a transaction that has taken place, two-way transaction. You have provided the product and your friend has given you money in that case. Then this entire concept is actually the concept of a market. Need not be a very formal structure of you going to a shopkeeper and buying something. It's just wherever buyer and supplier in any quantum. I am not saying I want millions of buyers and millions of sellers. In any quantum, if buyer and seller meet, then they form a market. So then the question that then arises is, what is a competitive market? A competitive market is one where you have buyers and sellers, but now the thing is that there are so many buyers and so many sellers that any particular individual seller or any particular individual buyer has negligible effect on price. So what really happens, which I will go ahead and talk about, is that there are, so it's like you going to a vegetable market where there are so many fruit vendors, there are so many vegetable vendors selling the same product, all of them selling the same onion, all of them selling the same potatoes. So now, because there are so many of them selling potatoes to you and there are so many of the households who are buying potatoes, in that case one particular seller cannot charge a price which is very different from the price that others are charging. He cannot decide the price. His audience wants the price that is being charged by other sellers. Otherwise, people will not buy from him. People will quote an example that others are giving at a lower price. So, this is the case, a classic example of where you have negligible effect on prices. Now, okay, so this is a competitive market, but the question that then arises is, what is a perfectly competitive market? A perfectly competitive market has one more property, which is that all the goods are exactly the same. So it is like now saying that I am having an individual A, I have an individual B, I have an individual C, I have an individual D, E. All of these people sell exactly the same quality of apple. Nothing is different in that apple. So A is also selling the same apple, B also, C, D, E. Everybody is selling same apple, same taste, same quality. Everything is the same. So the goods that are sold are exactly the same. Now, in this case, when goods sold are exactly the same, the buyers and sellers are also numerous. This is the property that we just got from competitive market. I'm calling it perfectly competitive now because I've added another property that goods are perfectly same. They're same as each other. So that becomes perfectly competitive. So the property that I now have is that buyers are and sellers are so numerous. There are so many that no one can affect the market price. Now, what does that exactly mean? So, you go into the market and you see 5 people and you see that all the 5 people are selling the same product. Now, there is this individual C whose cost of production of apples is 10 rupees. And because all of them are selling the same product, we also assume that all of them incur the same cost of production. So A also incurs rupees 10, B also incurs rupees 10, D also incurs rupees 10, and E also incurs rupees. The cost of production is exactly the same for all of them. Now, let's say that the first individual sells it for $8. He sells you apple at 8 rupee per apple, where he produces the apple for 10 rupee. B sells you for 9 rupee per apple, where he produces it for 10 rupee per apple. C sells you for 10 rupees per apple. D sells you for 11 rupees per apple, and E sells you for 12 rupees per apple. So D and E are making profit. A and B are in loss. C is in kind of a no profit, no loss situation, which in perfectly competitive firm is called a situation of normal profits. Now, what happens in case of normal profits is that it's a very different situation when I talk about perfectly competitive markets. We include something which is known as the opportunity cost, but we will revisit that thing later. So for now, you can assume that this individual C is in a no profit, no loss situation. So now, what happens in this case is, the question that arises is, which seller would exist in the market in the long run? So, you go to the market, you see that, A and B are selling it for very low price. So you go and you fetch from A and B. But in this case, the moment A and B start selling the product, they're selling it at a loss, they won't exist for a very long period. Very soon they will have to exit the market because they were making a loss. So either A and B would exit the market, or A and B would at least try and earn some money out of it, and A and B would sell it at least at rupees 10. Because now they are at a loss, why not make at least some profit? If not profit, at least a no loss no profit situation. So in this case, what really happens is that A and B either exit the market or they start increasing the price. Now let's talk about D and E. Now in this case, what really happens is you go to D and E and you tell them that, there is this person C who is selling exactly at 10 rupees. Because C is selling at 10 rupees, you will tell them that I don't want to buy from you because you are selling at a higher price and it's the same product. So in that case, what happens in the long run is D and E won't be able to sell anything. So in that case, D and E will have to reduce the price. If they reduce the price, they will bring down the price to 10. So the price that will exist in the market would be exactly 10. They will reduce the price because nobody will buy from them. They will increase the price because they are going at a loss. And these are the people who will exactly be selling in the market. Now, this situation here that we have is called being a price taker. You take the price from the market. And what is the price that you take from the market? The price is such that it is exactly equal to the marginal cost. Now, many of you, would not be aware of what marginal cost is. So for now, we will assume that, price is equal to the cost of production per unit. But later on, we will revisit the concept and actually explain what marginal cost actually means. Let us now try and understand the concept of demand. So there are two things that we have to understand. We should first understand what is demand, and then we have to understand what is the law of demand. But not only that, I will want you to understand what is demand, I also want you to understand the quantity demanded concept versus demand concept. So there are two things. One is called quantity demanded and the other is called demand. We would be revisiting these two concepts very soon. For now, let's understand the definition of quantity demanded. Now, whenever you go to the market, there are two main things that you should consider. First, you should be willing to buy a thing. Second, you should have the ability to buy that thing. Now, what are these two things and how are they different? First, suppose I go to the market and I am willing to buy the most luxurious diamond, the most luxurious stone, the most luxurious car. I want to go and buy a BMW. That is my willingness to buy. I have full willingness to buy that thing. But would I be able to buy? Maybe yes, maybe no. So, if I don't have the ability to buy the thing, just the willingness is not sufficient for that demand, for that product to be completed. I cannot just have the willingness be a sufficiency condition for me to go and demand a thing. Now, the other thing round. Suppose I have the ability to buy a thing. I have 500 bucks with me and there is this book which costs 350 rupees. But I am not interested in reading stuff. I don't like reading that much. I would rather go and buy something else out of those 350 bucks. So I have the ability to buy a thing, but I am not willing to buy that book. I'm not willing to buy that product. Now, if I have both, if I have the willingness to buy a thing and at the same time I have the ability to buy a thing, then that completes the concept of demand. In such case, if I have the willingness and the ability to buy those things, then that is called, whatever amount I buy at that particular existing price becomes the quantity demanded. So what is quantity demand? At a particular price, if I have willingness and ability, then the quantity that I buy becomes quantity demanded. Okay. Now there is another thing that we must understand. So for example, okay, this is good enough that, suppose there is a book which costs rupees 350, and suppose I have a willingness to buy. I love reading books, so I have my willingness to buy that book, and I have 500 rupees in my pocket. So I also have the ability to buy the book. Now the question that then arises is, if the price of the book increases, then what happens to my demand? Suppose the price is now 550. Then although I am willing to buy the book, my ability to buy the book would not be there. So my demand would fall from 1 unit, which I could initially buy the book, to 0 units because I no more can buy the book. So that gives rise to the law of demand. What is law of demand? Law of demand states that the quantity demanded is inversely related to the price of the commodity. It says that whatever quantity I'm going to demand, that is inversely related to the price that exists in the market. As price of product increases, the amount that you demand would decrease, and this thing is called the law of demand. Now, if I have to understand the law of demand, there are two important things that I must understand. The first thing is called demand schedule. Now, what is a demand schedule? A demand schedule is of tabular format, where what do? You write down the price of commodity, and correspondingly you mention how much quantity was demanded at a price. So when the price is 0, the quantity demanded is 16. When the price increases to 1, the quantity demanded decreases, because it's human tendency. As price will increase, you will buy less of that good. So as price keeps on increasing, the quantity that you keep demanding keeps falling. So this table that you draw, which shows the relationship between price and quantity, is called the demand schedule. So demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between price of good and the quantity demanded. Okay. Now, so if I have this in mind that, at price of 1, it is 14, at price of 2, it is 12, at price of 3, it is 10, and so on. If I have this in mind, it is very easy for me to go ahead and plot this thing. So, I can take price and I can take quantity, and I can say that, okay, at price of 1, this is the quantity. The quantity is 14. At price 0, it was 16. At price 2, it is 12. At price 3 it is 10, and so on, and I will get a negatively sloped line. This line is called the demand curve. So let's see exactly what is happening. So this is how a typical demand schedule and a demand curve looks like. So what we are going to do is we are now going to plot this thing together. So what has happened here is that these are different prices, and as we can see, as the price is increasing, the quantity demanded is decreasing. So let's plot when price is 0, the quantity demanded is 16. When price is 1, the quantity demanded is 14. When price is 2, the quantity demanded is 12. When price is 3, the quantity demanded is 10. When price is 4, the quantity demanded is 8. When price is 5, it is 6. When it is 6, it is 4. So this is now called my demand curve. Now, there is one more very important thing that I would like to highlight here. So if you see here, you would observe that, so we understand that price is changing in the market, and as price is changing, I'm affecting my quantity, right? So which means that quantity demanded is actually an X kind of variable. It's a free variable. It's an independent variable. Sorry, price is an independent variable which is determined in the market. And actually quantity demanded depends on the price that exists in the market. So if the price is 1, accordingly I determine my quantity to be 14. If the price is 2, accordingly I determine my quantity to be 12. So I calculate the amount that I'm going to consume depending on the price that exists in the market. If that is the case, if price is an independent variable, then in that case, price should have been on the x-axis and quantity demanded should have been on the y-axis, because quantity demanded is a function of price. But actually, this is not what is taking place. Quantity demanded is coming on the x-axis and price is coming on the y-axis. Therefore, this curve, instead of being called as the demand curve, is called the inverse demand curve or the inverse demand function. We are plotting an inverse relationship. We are showing price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Now, let's now go and understand what is market demand and how is it different from the individual demand. So we now understand that for any particular individual, as the price keeps on increasing, the amount that that individual would be consuming would be lower. If that is the case, then that is true for any individual. So, I take two individuals now. I say, okay, that this is individual 1 or individual A, and I say this is individual B, or this is Helen and this is Ken. So now what is happening is, let's say that the price is 0, and at price 0, the quantity demanded by Helen is 16 and the quantity demanded by Ken is 8. So the total quantity demanded is 24. Now suppose price increases. When price increases, both of them will demand a lower quantity. So he reduces from 16 to 14 and he reduces from 8 to 7. Because both of them reduce the quantities that they consume, the sum also reduces to 21. This is the market demand, because I'm summing up the individual demands. So market demand is nothing but the sum of quantity demanded by all individuals I, and I is from 1 to n. Different individuals exist in the market. Similarly, at price 2, because prices increased further, he would decrease his demand, he would also decrease his demand, so total demand in the market would decrease. So the new quantity demanded would be 18. Remember, I am emphasizing that we are talking about quantity demanded because we are talking about demand as a function of price for now, and so on. So this keeps on happening, the price keeps on increasing, each of the individual keeps on reducing the quantity. Because each individual is reducing the quantity, the total quantity in the market is also reducing, because it's just the sum. If we have to now plot market demand versus individual demands, then how would that look like? To understand that, let's take few individuals and try to see what happens in. Let us now try and understand the market demand curve and graphically. So let's say that I have this as the demand curve of individual A. I'll plot it. So I'll plot it for A. I'm taking 3 individuals. So let's say I have some individual B and I have some individual C. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to also talk about how I'm going to sum the 3 demands, and I'm going to bring in the concept of market demand. So let's say that at price 1, the individual demands 10 units. This is individual A. And as price increases, demand decreases to, let's say, 8 units. Similarly, I have individual B. So at price 1, individual B demands 3 units. At price 2, he demands 1 unit. I have individual C. At price 1, individual C demands 5 units, and at price 2, as price increases, demand decreases. So it comes down all the way to 1 unit. He's too sensitive to the price. So a increase in price really decreases his demand. Now let's say that I take the price to be 1. So the price is the same, price was 1 for all the individuals. So when price is 1 for individual 1, the demand is 10 units, and then it goes down to 8 units. So it is 10 units, and when the price is 2, draw a line. When the price is 2, the demand is 8 units. For individual B, when price is 1, the demand is 3 units, so somewhere here. And when price increases, the demand decreases to 1 unit, so all the way here, so somewhere over here. For individual C, when price is 1, the demand is 5 units, and it goes all the way to 1 unit. So 5 unit and 1 unit. Let's plot these demand. So these are the demand schedules. This is price, quantity, price, and quantity. Let's try and plot these individual demand schedules to get demand curves for individuals. So individual A, individual B, and this is going to be a little flatter, individual C. So now what I have to do is that I have to find out the market demand. So to find out the market demand, I'm going to add in the 3 demands. So when price is 1, the demand is 10 plus 3 plus 5. So the demand is 18. When price is 2, the demand is 8 plus 1 plus 1. So the demand is 10. So when price is 1, the demand is 18, somewhere here, and it goes all the way to 10 when the price is 2. So I plot this, and I get the market demand. Observe that because the market demand curve really is summing up individual demands, the market demand curve has to be flatter than individual demands. Now, how do I know that it is supposed to be flatter? So understand that usually what is happening is, it is going to be flatter if the change is more, right? For one unit change in price, if the quantity changes by a huge amount, then it is flatter. If for 1 unit change in price, the quantity just changes by very little amount, it is going to be steeper. That is what we observe, right? So here, when the quantity changed by 2 units, it was steeper. When the quantity changed by 4 units, it became a little flatter, right? Because this gap is more. So suppose I say that when price was 1, the quantity was 10, and when price is 2, the quantity is just 1. So it is going to be too flat, right? So because here market demand curve is summing up individual demands, so individual demands are lower, so the sum would be too low, so the gap would be very high, so it ends up being a little flatter. So this is always the case, that market demand curve is flatter than individual demand curves. Okay. So this is all about the market demand curve. Let us now go ahead and understand demand curve shifters. Now this is very important. Why? Because now what I'm going to tell you is about the factors which affect your demand but are not really price. So I have understood till now that price is one factor which affects the demand, and we have understood that as price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. But is there something else which can affect your demand? So yes, there are things which can affect your demand. For example, your income. When your income increases, you should demand more. Or for example, your taste and preferences. All of a sudden, I'm very diet conscious, so I start demanding more sprouts. I start demanding more of diet coke rather than the usual coke. I start demanding more of nutritious food. Or because there is COVID-19, I want to have a very strong immune system, so I start demanding citrus fruits. So things which are not related to price, but they affect your demand. Now, those things, so understand what is happening. When I was plotting the demand curve, I had price and quantity on one of the axes, right? One side I had price and one I had quantity. Now I am saying that, price is not changing, but still demand or quantity is changing because of other factors. So, price of good is still 8 rupees, but I buy more sanitizers because I have a preference towards sanitizer. Then that would lead to shift of curve. And why would the curve shift? Because the price did not change and still the demand. So suppose I was initially consuming 10 units, I'm now consuming 12 units because I have a preference towards buying that thing, or maybe because my income increased or something or the other. So that is where shift of demand curve takes place. So whenever price changes, you have movement along the demand curve, because that enables you to draw the demand curve using the demand schedule. And whenever factors other than price change, it leads to the shift of the demand curve, forward or backward, depending on whether demand increased or decreased. So the demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, other things being equal. These other things are non-price determinants like buyers' demand for good other than goods price. This shifts the demand curve. So the first factor that we have to now consider is called the number of buyers, and this is very obvious. So basically I'm not going to talk about the quantity demanded, but here actually it is in fact going to talk about the market demand. So remember, market demand was demand by A, demand by B, and demand by C, and so on. Now assume that there is an increase in population. Whenever population increases, number of people increase, and hence suppose there is an addition to my population, say D and E. So obviously the total demand would increase. Now this demand is increasing irrespective of the price. The price of good is still the same, but because population increased, demand increased. So it's like saying that at the existing price is whatever, initially this was the demand, but now at this price I'm going to demand more because more people are buying it. So the demand is going to shift and the demand curve shifts to the right. The next factor that we would consider, so this is how a typical graph looks like. When there is an increase in the number of buyers, the demand increases, total demand increases. So at any given price, the demand curve shifts to the right. Now, the second thing that you have to understand is how demand changes when income changes. And here we are going to talk about two things in economics. The first thing is known as a normal good, and the second is known as an inferior good. Now, a normal good is any good where when your income increases, demand increases. This is like a general good, the usual things we consume. So when my income increases, I increase the demand of the good, and that becomes a normal good. Now, an inferior good is a good where when my income increases, demand decreases. So an example of this that I've already quoted is an example of a country where we were consuming potatoes and meat. So with time, when the price of potatoes decreased and when my real income increased, I stopped consuming potatoes and I started consuming more of meat. So ideally for now, it is sufficient for you to understand that there do exist goods where when your income increases, the demand decreases, and those goods are called the inferior goods. So suppose, now I tell you that there is an increase in income and I ask you what should be the effect on the demand curve. So the answer that you would give is that if it is a normal good, then an increase in income would increase the demand and hence my demand curve would shift to the right. But if it is an inferior good, then because increase in income decreases demand, then at any price I'm going to consume less and the demand curve is going to shift backwards. So these are the two scenarios of the shift in the demand curve. The next factor that we have to consider is called the price of related goods. Now here, when we talk about the price of related goods, I'm going to talk about two goods. The first good is called as a substitute good. Now what is a substitute good? Substitute goods are those goods which can be used in place of each other. So for example, for me, a ball pen and an ink pen would be substitutes because it doesn't really matter for me whether I'm using a ball pen or whether I'm using a gel pen. So for me, a ball pen versus gel pen are substitute goods. Similarly, for me, Coke and Pepsi are substitute goods. It doesn't really matter to my taste and preferences whether I'm using Coke or I'm using Pepsi. Or for me, tea and coffee are substitute goods. I'm equally indifferent between using and drinking tea or drinking coffee. Now, in this case, where goods are substitute goods, we have to understand how does the demand of one good gets affected when the price of the other good gets affected. So, let's say that I'm talking about tea and coffee. Now, let's say that the price of tea increased. Because the price of tea increased, I should definitely reduce the demand. So, from law of demand, increase in price of tea would mean decrease in the quantity of tea. So I will consume less of tea. But I still have to consume something. And I still know that the price of coffee is unchanged. It didn't change, right? The question just tells me that, or the scenario just tells me that the price of tea increased. So because the price of tea increased, the quantity of tea should, actually this is quantity demanded of tea should decrease, because this is directly getting affected by its own price. Now here what happens is, because the price decreases and the quantity demanded increases and this decreases, this leads to increase in the quantity of coffee. I'm going to consume more coffee because I will substitute tea for. Okay. Now, how does this look in the graph? So, let's say that this is the market for tea. And let's say that this is the market for coffee. Now, this is the demand function of tea and this is the demand function of coffee. Suppose that the initial price that existed in the market for tea was rupees 8, and at the same price of rupees 8, the demand for coffee was 4 units and the demand for tea was 8 units. Suppose something like that. Now, suppose I tell you that the price of tea has increased and it has become 10 rupees. So, when the price increases to 10 rupees, I should reduce the quantity demanded of tea. So, I move backward and I now just consume 6 units of tea. So, understand that there is a movement along the curve. The price increased and demand decreased. Quantity demanded decreased. Now here, because the quantity demanded of tea decreased, people shifted towards coffee, and at the existing price of coffee, the demand of coffee increased. There are two things that take place simultaneously, which are movement along the curve for tea market, in bracket, change in quantity demanded. And at the same time, there is shift in the demand curve of coffee in bracket change in demand of coffee. This is due to price and this is due to factor other than price. So this is the complete mechanism how it takes place. Let us now try and understand the other kind of related goods, and those goods are called complementary goods. Now, what are complements? Complements are goods which are used together. So, for example, let's say that my left shoe and right shoe, they are complement for me. Or let's say that, my pen and the ink that I use inside the pen are complementary goods. Suppose now that in case of pen and ink, the price of pen increases. Now, if the price of pen increases, then I should reduce the quantity demanded. So the quantity demanded decreases. Now, with this part, I know if I use less of pens, then the ink that I'm going to use to refill this pen, so this is the ink that I'm going to use to refill this pen would also be used less. So this would lead to the lower demand for ink as well. So, from this, what happens is that if I have to now draw everything together, actually, this is going to look something like this. This is the market for pen and this is the market for ink. So suppose the existing price is 5 rupees and the quantity demanded is 10 units per at the rate of 5 rupee each, and suppose the price increases to 6 rupees and at 6 rupees I'm going to demand 8 units at the rate of 6 rupees each, and the demand curve that I'm going to have is this. Then when, because the price increased and the quantity decreased, quantity demanded, there is a movement along the curve from point A to B. But this is the market demand curve for ink. This is the demand curve for ink. And because you would now require less of ink also, the demand curve is going to shift backward. So there is a shift of demand curve. And here there is a movement along the curve. Okay. So that is how things are for complementary goods. Let us now try and understand few more factors. So the next factor is taste. So in taste, what happens, as I told you, if you have positive preference towards taste, you are going to demand more. So for example, in case of Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, suppose I'm all of a sudden very nutritious, I want to consume less calories, I'll increase their demand. So the demand curve will shift to the right. Simple. The last thing that we have to understand is the case scenario of expectations. Now, this is very interesting. So, for example, I am expecting that the demand of, so for example, I'm expecting that the demand is going to increase for, so for example, I am expecting that my income is going to increase in the future. And the future is not very far. For example, it's mid of May, and I'm expecting that in June I'm going to get some bonus, I'm going to get a hike, and I'm going to get higher income, then in May itself will have a tendency to increase my shopping. I might want to increase the demand of clothes, I might want to increase the demand of shoes, I might want to go for a trip, book a trip, because I am sure that from June onwards I would be getting a better salary, I would get increased salary, or I would get a bonus. So, because of better expectations, my demand increases and the demand curve would shift to the right. Similarly, if I'm expecting that recession is going to come, the salaries are going to go down, I'm going to reduce the demand today itself and the demand curve is going to shift backwards. The next thing that we have to do is to collate everything together. Let's summarize it. So the first variable that we studied is actually the price. This leads to movement along the curve, and this is called change in quantity demanded. The next that we read was number of buyers. This leads to shift of the curve. Income, it leads to shift, but which direction will depend on normal versus inferior good. If it is normal good, shifts to right. If it is inferior good, shifts to left. Price of related goods, again, depends whether I'm talking about substitutes or complements. Both of them have a case scenario. Taste, whether I develop a positive taste or a negative taste towards a thing. So, it might be possible that for some time now, we don't want to eat street food because we want to take care of our hygiene. So we can develop a negative taste also towards something. And expectations, whether I have positive expectations or negative expectations. All these lead to shift of the curve, and all of these actually are called change in demand. And whereas this is called change in quantity demanded. So that is all about demand. We should practice few questions on demand before we go ahead and we talk about supply.